So I want to talk about what is better, micro or macro, and talk to you about what actually leads to the performance of people and organizations. There's lots of sort of things on the micro side. What I'm really talking about is generally when people are talking about that is like psychology and looking at, the sort of small side of things. However, in my perspective, I have a very broad perspective on micro versus macro. I'm going to talk about that in 1 second. But on the macro side, people are often talking about, how does a company actually perform and what's the strategy that they perform, what's the structure that they have, those kind of aspects to it. And ultimately, what you'll find out if you do look at this broadly, both of them matter. Both aspects of it, right? Like the individual personality or the individual characteristics and traits, the individual ways that people learn matter. And it does impact how, companies perform and what's going on. Despite all the fact of, I'm really critical on the fact that, it's impossible to measure performance, and I'm very critical on most of the sort of empirical stuff that is done in management. I'm super critical of it because I don't believe a lot of how it's actually done and the results that we get. I just don't get it, and I don't believe it. However, that being said, if you sort of look at how things actually work, personality and traits and individuals, they make a difference. And if you just simply look at that on face validity alone, if you go back to the 1940s and 50s and you look to see it, just people sort of interacting, we forgot about all the sort of methodological stuff, what you're going to sort of find out just on face validity that it actually does matter. And I believe that. And on the other side, the macro side, you might be thinking of, like choosing the strategy and, having the right structure and having the right, protocols and routines and operating procedures and all this kind of stuff. We know that affects it too. And, sometimes it has negative effects. Sometimes it has positive effects. We know that actually plays an important role. And I am, equally skeptical of how we measure these things and capture these things. And I just have a great deal of disbelief, given the sort of how science is done in general. I just don't believe it. But that being said, just simply look at the world around you and you start to get a sense of like, wait a minute, you know what? There is differences in strategy, and there is differences in how things are organized in terms of the structure that these companies have. And generally does seem to make some sort of difference, right? If you go back to the day of not being able to measure these things, we could probably say, hey, you know what? It makes a difference. But, here's what I'm saying and thinking about in terms of macro and micro, and why I have a really, very wide perspective, is that I've studied a lot of phenomenon, from engineering aspects to chemicals to, reading about institutions and regulatory authorities and all these sort of things. There's the way that we do work varies dramatically across the level of analysis that you actually choose. And you could choose the level of compounds and molecules and chemicals and be able to sort of explain the world and how companies actually work through that. And lots of companies do that, right? We can use an electron perspective where we look to see at the operations of how software works, and you see the transfer of electrons, for example, in software. But then you can also look at, at a very, very high level and think about like, how does each individual country is actually impacting, how companies actually operate. I've seen to the extent, and it's more of like a comical kind of study where somebody looked at sunspots and looked at the impact of sunspots on performance. It was more of a comical study to show that, you can correlate anything together. And you know, what I want to sort of point out is that it all kind of matters, and it all sort of compounds with each other. And we typically can't necessarily say like, hey, this is the one thing that causes or leads to some significant performance result. I can't tell you that. Nobody can tell you that. If anybody's going to tell you that, hey, this is one thing that you need to do and everything's going to come together and you're going to make a lot of, you know, money or performance, or whatever it is, right? Like, you're going to have increased safety. You're going to be more efficient. You know, you're going to, in terms of the micro sense, you might be like more productive and all this. There's not one thing. There never is one thing, and what it is a combination of everything put together. It's a combination of what the task actually looks like. What are the characteristics, the individual characteristics of the task? What are the characteristics of the individual? What's characteristics of how the work is getting done? What's the institutional environment? What's the country? Like, everything comes together to lead to something. So, you know, it's foolhardy to say, like, just focus on this one thing. I think that's, like, stupid to say, hey, just do this one thing. The only thing that I can say actually is pretty universal, I would say, is that the pattern that things improve when you dedicate time and effort to it. That's pretty universal that I've seen. It's a pretty universal pattern. And you know, across different sort of levels of analysis and how we sort of see the world and all that kind of stuff. But it's not universally, it's not a rules for riches, right? Like, you can struggle at something for a long time. There's lots of mathematicians and physics, theoretical physicists have struggled with problems for years and years and years and don't appear to be productive, right? So what I want to say is that the world is entirely a lot more complex than anybody's going to ever point out. I can't tell you how to, you know, become rich and wealthy. The only thing that I can say is these sort of general macro trends. That's why I say bet on index funds. It's betting on the global economy. I can't tell you anything other than that. The global economy might implode. Well, then that's kind of a craptacular investment advice to buy index funds and a proportion of your funds being in index funds. But, you know, it's the best we have. And that's what I would sort of stick by. I would be very, you know, very conservative in what I suggest, because there's not a lot that we can suggest based on what we understand. I can't go in and say, do this, that, and the other thing. I'm very doubtful at this point. I really don't understand. I am more convinced, after studying in many different areas and looking at many different things, I'm more convinced that I don't know what the hell I'm doing, and I don't think other people know what the hell that they're doing either. I'm really convinced of that. So with that, I wanted to say, take care and have a wonderful day. Bye.